And now we come to 1 Kings. 1 Kings is another one of those books about the history of the children of Israel. 1 and 2 Kings were probably one book originally, and it continues the narrative that has been carried on from 1 and 2 Samuel, which you've just been hearing about it. No one is very sure about who wrote the book. Some think it could have been Ezra or Ezekiel or Jeremiah, but it's not clear who wrote the history or over this period of about 400 years. The book starts with the end of the reign of King David that you've just been listening to, and it's about 970 BC. And a man, David, who's described as having a heart after God, and he saw much peace and much success during his long reign, and that's right at the beginning of 1 Kings. Then David died in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 10. Solomon became king, and Israel moved forward to more and more prosperity and peace under Solomon's reign. The economy was great. Solomon's military power was so awesome that he had very few wars to deal with because none of his neighbors were able to come and to be threatened by him at all. He was a great king, very wise, and his management was especially impressive. Then Solomon died. So you've gone from David and now to Solomon. Solomon's death was in 931 BC, and you can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 43. And then the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of the children of Israel, was divided into the northern and southern regions. The north was called Israel, the south was called Judah, and 1 Kings is a record of the history of the ups and the downs of this now divided kingdom until about 853 BC. So it's covering that period of time. And you know what? It's the same old story. The kings that ruled under God's authority were blessed. And those that didn't, it didn't go well for them. And because of that, it didn't go well then for the children of Israel. In 1 Kings, there's a dominant prophetic figure. His name is Elijah, the prophet. And Elijah was not afraid to pronounce judgment on any king who did not live according to the godly principles and to the law, to the Ten Commandments. Of course, Elijah also did some outstanding miracles, including, you remember, that showdown with the false prophets on Mount Carmel when he called down fire to consume the burnt offerings, while the false prophets were left red-faced after a complete failure as Elijah taunted them to shout louder in case their God was asleep. What a prophet he was. And then, of course, within 1 Kings, you get introduced to Elisha, who was later to receive Elijah's anointing. And so in the middle of all the kings that were happening there was the prophetic voice of the prophets still speaking the word of the Lord. So as you work through 1 Kings, and Rachel and myself have just recently been reading through Kings, and we've been reading it out loud day after day after day, and sometimes it's felt a little bit irksome, but you know, it's really good to read it all. Don't just read your favorite verses, read it all. And when you read through it, you'll read about some kings, they lived right, and some kings who didn't. But most of them, you keep reading this phrase that they did what was right in the eyes of God, or so they didn't have a heart after God, but most of them didn't tear down the Asherah poles. And it was only those who went as far as tearing down the Asherah poles who went on to be great rulers. So what is all the fuss about the Asherah poles? Well, it's an issue of worship. You know, the Bible elsewhere says that we're supposed to worship the Lord our God with all of our hearts and have no other God before me. And when the kings in 1 Kings left an Asherah pole standing, it was a visible temptation for the children of Israel to drift in their worship from God to this. And Asherah pole was called the mother goddess and became the mother of Baal, and it became a distraction to the children of Israel, and they started to dabble into the areas of pagan worship, and God was having none of it. He would not share his glory with some pagan pole. And you know, God has not changed his mind either. That's why worship is such an important thing for us to get hold of in our day. Let's worship the Lord with all of our hearts. Don't mix it. Don't get into some pagan stuff. Don't get into some just materialistic stuff. Tear down the Asher poles and worship God alone. And when you read 1 Kings, you will find out the ups and downs of 1 Kings. They really revolve around this thing about the Asherah pole and, of course, the significant character of Solomon. So what's my key verse? Well, as the prelude to that, in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5, God asks Solomon a question and says, ask for whatever you want to give me, or what you want me to give you. I mean, if God were to ask you right now, sat there watching this broadcast and say, you can ask anything you want, what would you ask? Well, I asked myself that when I was studying for this, and I was thinking like, well, I know the rest of the story, but what would I ask? 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 9 is my key verse. This is where Solomon gives his answer. This is my one verse for tonight. Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. In other words, give me wisdom. And if you were to read it on later in verse 10, you'll find that the Lord was pleased with the request and that he said, it's good that you haven't asked for long life or for wealth, but you've asked for wisdom. Wisdom is key. You know, because of this, Solomon was able from that moment on to go and live his life and be a ruler, one of the great kings of Israel, who ruled with success because of this prayer. You know, wealth and success and long life came as a consequence of wisdom. Wisdom was the key that opened the door. It opened the door to smart decisions, good choices, discernment into the things so that he saw beyond the obvious, and wisdom brought blessing and prosperity and success into his life, and it will for you and for me too. It's a huge lesson for us, isn't it? How often do we ask God to give us wisdom and insight and discernment and understanding? Solomon himself wrote later in Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 5, get wisdom. And in Proverbs 4 and verse 7 it says, wisdom is supreme, therefore get wisdom, though it cost you everything you have. And then again in Proverbs 4 verse 8, esteem wisdom, and wisdom will exalt you. Wisdom is the key. And this is the key verse in the middle of this. If only all those other kings had have had the wisdom to have worshipped God first, tear down the Asherah poles, then, you know, the history of the children of Israel would have been very different. Solomon knew the value of asking God for wisdom rather than being driven by a personal agenda or comfort request and getting quick fixes. We often ask God for things for now, those short-term comforts, when actually we really should be asking God for the eternal things. So what now? What does all this mean? So what? You know, perhaps you need this evening and over the next couple of days to spend some time adjusting your asking. Rather than asking God just for the things, why not ask God for some wisdom? Some wisdom that makes you to be in the right place at the right time with the right people for the right purpose, so that you can make smart choices that leave you steadfast and secure and established in life. And your life then changes from being a series of calamities where we lurch from one bad choice to another to a life that is established and is really blessed. Just a final thought. Asherah poles. Can't stop thinking about Asherah poles and asking ourselves in this moment, what distractions are in your life or in mine that attract us and point our eye and take our eyes away from Jesus? We need to pull down those Asherah poles. The only pole that should be standing in our life is the pole called the cross, where Jesus died and loved us and gave himself for us. You know, I'm looking forward to a generation that's coming that will look back to this COVID time and said there was a people who pulled down the Asherah poles, a time when the people sought wisdom and God was glorified, enemies were trampled, the church was triumphant, and revival spread like a wildfire. I tell you, we need to learn from the Old Testament kings. We need to seek wisdom, and we need to pull down the poles. And that's 1 Kings.